Captain Ezra Blackwater felt the cold grip of death as his ship, the Crimson Revenge, split apart beneath the crushing weight of enemy cannon fire. The notorious pirate who had terrorized the Caribbean for 20 years was dragged into the depths, his lungs filling with seawater as darkness consumed him. But death had other plans. When consciousness returned, Ezra found himself being pushed through crystal-clear waters by creatures he'd only heard about in sailors' tales, dolphins, their sleek bodies guiding him toward an unknown shore. The impossible rescue left him gasping on white sand, staring at the pod that had somehow chosen to save his life rather than let him perish with his ship. As the dolphins disappeared into the deep blue, Ezra realized his survival wasn't mere chance. But what could these mysterious creatures want with a man whose hands were stained with decades of blood and plunder? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun's merciless heat beat down on Ezra's salt-encrusted skin as he struggled to his feet, his waterlogged boots squelching in the pristine sand. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, reminders of the violent end that had claimed the Crimson Revenge. His weathered hands instinctively reached for the twin pistols that had been his constant companions for 2 decades, finding only empty holsters and the bitter taste of seawater still burning his throat. The beach stretched before him like a crescent moon of white sand, bordered by dense tropical vegetation that rustled with unseen life. Behind him, the endless expanse of blue ocean showed no trace of the battle that had raged just hours before. No floating debris, no bodies of his crew, no evidence that his ship had ever existed except for the brass compass clutched in his right hand, its needle still pointing steadfast north, despite its journey through the depths. Ezra examined the compass with reverence, its familiar weight an anchor to his identity. Captain Bartholomew Thorne had given it to him 23 years ago, back when Ezra was still a merchant sailor with calloused hands and honest intentions. "A man needs direction in this world, boy," the old captain had said. "This compass will never lie to you, even when everything else does." How prophetic those words seemed now, when Ezra couldn't even trust his own salvation. The memories of the battle crashed over him like another wave. The Spanish treasure galleon had been too tempting a prize, its hull heavy with gold bound for Seville. But Admiral Vega's escort ships had been waiting in ambush, their cannons loaded, and crews prepared for the notorious Captain Blackwater. The fight had been brutal and decisive, 18 years of piracy ending in a symphony of splintering wood and screaming men. His crew, 37 souls who had followed him through countless raids, were gone. Miguel, his first mate, who could navigate by stars alone. Young Tommy, barely 16, who had joined them seeking adventure. One-eyed Sarah, the only woman fierce enough to earn respect among Caribbean pirates. All of them now feeding the fish, while he stood alone on this mysterious shore. Ezra's legs trembled as he took his first tentative steps along the waterline. The sand was different here, finer than any beach he'd known, almost powder-soft beneath his feet. Strange shells dotted the shoreline, spiraled things he'd never seen in all his travels, colored in hues that seemed to shift in the changing light. This place felt removed from the world he knew, as if the dolphins had carried him beyond the edge of any map. The practical concerns of survival began to assert themselves over philosophical questions. His throat felt like sandpaper, and his stomach cramped with hunger. The tropical sun would burn him to leather if he didn't find shelter soon. Fresh water was the priority. Without it, he'd be dead within days. As he explored the immediate area, something caught his eye near a cluster of palm trees. There, half buried in sand, lay one of his pistols. The ornate weapon that had ended more lives than he cared to count was now nothing more than a useless chunk of metal and wood. Its powder chamber flooded with seawater, its firing mechanism corroded by salt. He picked it up anyway, feeling the weight of a tool that had defined his identity for so long. The irony wasn't lost on him. Captain Ezra Blackwater, scourge of the Caribbean, feared by merchants and naval officers alike, now reduced to a castaway with no weapons, no crew, and no ship. The Dolphins had saved his life, but for what purpose? To die slowly of thirst on a paradise that might as well be hell. A rustling in the vegetation behind him made Ezra spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the useless pistol. But no threat emerged, only a large iguana that regarded him with ancient, unblinking eyes before disappearing into the green shadows. Even the wildlife here seemed different, as if this island existed in its own separate reality. The compass needle swung as Ezra turned, always finding north with unwavering certainty. At least something in this strange new world remained constant. He tucked the instrument carefully into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, and began walking inland. Somewhere beyond the tree line he could hear the musical sound of running water, his first ray of hope since awakening on this impossible shore. The sound of fresh water led Ezra deeper into the island's interior, where towering palm trees gave way to a denser canopy of unfamiliar vegetation. Vines thick as ship's rope draped between massive trees whose trunks could have sheltered his entire crew. The air grew cooler here, heavy with the scent of rich earth and blooming flowers he couldn't name. After 20 minutes of careful navigation through the undergrowth, Ezra discovered the the musical water sound, a crystal-clear stream that bubbled up from somewhere deep within the island's rocky heart. The water tasted sweeter than any he'd known, free of the brackish taint that plagued most Caribbean sources. He drank deeply, feeling strength return to his limbs with each swallow. While cupping the precious liquid to his mouth, something caught his eye beneath the water's surface. Half buried in the sandy streambed lay a flat stone unlike any natural formation he'd seen. Ezra pulled it free, brushing away decades of sediment to reveal intricate carvings etched into its surface. The stone tablet bore symbols that seemed to dance in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Curved lines intertwined with geometric patterns, and at the center, an unmistakable image of dolphins arranged in a circle around what appeared to be a human figure. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each line carved with precision that spoke of skilled artisans and deep spiritual meaning. Ezra's weathered fingers traced the carvings, feeling the smooth grooves worn by countless years of weather and water. He'd seen similar work in Aztec ruins along the Mexican coast, but these symbols carried a different quality, older, somehow more elemental. The dolphins in the carving seemed to be guiding the human figure toward something, though what that destination might be remained unclear. As he examined the tablet more closely, other evidence of human habitation became apparent. Moss-covered stones arranged in deliberate patterns suggested the foundation of a long-vanished structure. The stream itself had been channeled at some point, its banks reinforced with carefully placed rocks that created small pools perfect for bathing or washing clothes. Someone had lived here once, perhaps many people over many years. But when and why had they left? The vegetation had reclaimed most traces of their presence, but enough remained to paint a picture of a settlement that had thrived in harmony with the island's natural rhythms. Following the stream toward higher ground, Ezra discovered more evidence of the island's mysterious past. Stone steps carved directly into a hillside led to a natural plateau, where the remains of several circular foundations were barely visible beneath the green carpet of returned jungle. Each circle was roughly the same size, suggesting individual dwellings arranged around a central gathering space. In the middle of this ancient village site stood the most remarkable discovery yet, a massive stone altar covered in the same intricate carvings as the tablet he'd found by the stream. The dolphins appeared here too, but in greater numbers and more elaborate arrangements. They seemed to be participating in some kind of ceremony, their bodies forming patterns that reminded Ezra of the constellations his navigator Miguel had used to guide the Crimson Revenge through moonless nights. The altar's surface was stained dark with age, and shallow channels carved into the stone suggested it had once been used for liquid offerings. But there was nothing sinister about the markings, no evidence of sacrifice or violence. Instead, the entire structure radiated a sense of reverence, as if it had been a place where people came to honor something greater than themselves. Ezra climbed onto the altar's platform and gazed out over the island spread below him. From this vantage point he could see the beach where he'd awakened, the stream that had led him here, and beyond that, patches of different terrain, what appeared to be a natural harbor on the island's eastern shore, and several other beaches accessible by land. The island was larger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 3 miles across at its widest point. More importantly, he could see the dolphins. The same pod that had rescued him now swam in lazy circles in the calm waters beyond the reef that protected the island's shores. Even from this distance, their presence felt significant, as if they were waiting for something. The carved tablet seemed to grow heavier in Ezra's hands as understanding began to dawn. This wasn't the first time the Dolphins had brought someone to this island. The ancient settlement, the ceremonial altar, the reverent carvings, all of it suggested a long history of rescue and transformation. But transformation into what? As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ezra made his way back to the stream to establish a temporary camp. He found a spot where overhanging rocks would provide shelter from rain, close enough to the water source, but hidden from view of anyone approaching from the sea. Using techniques learned during his years of raids on remote settlements, he gathered dry wood and managed to start a small fire using flint and steel from his belt pouch. One of the few useful items that had survived his underwater journey. The flames danced against the carved stone tablet as darkness settled over the island, and Ezra found himself staring into the carved dolphin's eyes, wondering what ancient promises they represented and what role he was meant to play in their enduring story. Dawn broke with the sound of waves carrying something heavy onto the shore. Ezra emerged from his makeshift shelter to find the tide had delivered a grim gift, pieces of the crimson revenge scattered across the sand like broken bones. Splintered masts, torn sailcloth, and fragments of the hull that had been his home for 18 years now lay before him, each piece a testament to the violence that had ended his life as a pirate captain. Among the debris, something glinted in the morning sun. Ezra's breath caught as he recognized the ornate handle of his cutlass, the blade that had carved his reputation across the Caribbean. The weapon was encrusted with barnacles and seaweed, its once gleaming steel now pitted with corrosion, but it was unmistakably. He pulled it free from the tangled remains of rigging, feeling the familiar weight despite its degraded condition. The cutlass had been forged in Toledo steel, a gift from Don Carlos Mendoza after Ezra had spared the Spanish noble's life during a raid on his merchant vessel. That act of mercy, rare in his profession, had earned him both a magnificent weapon and a dangerous reputation for unpredictability. Pirates who showed mercy were either weak or calculating, and Ezra had never been weak. As he held the barnacle-encrusted blade, memories flooded back with painful clarity. The first time he'd drawn it in anger was during the mutiny that had transformed him from merchant sailor to pirate. Captain Thorne, the man who'd given him the compass, had been selling his crew to Spanish slavers. The betrayal had shattered Ezra's faith in honest work, and the cutlass had tasted its first blood in the name of justice, or so he'd told himself. But justice had a way of becoming vengeance, and vengeance had a way of becoming habit. The blade had taken so many lives over the years that Ezra had stopped counting after the 50th. Merchants who'd fought too hard to protect their cargo, naval officers who'd refused to surrender, fellow pirates who'd challenged his authority. Each death had seemed necessary at the time, justified by the harsh laws of the sea. Now, staring at the corroded weapon, Ezra saw it for what it truly was, a tool of destruction that had brought him nothing but temporary wealth and lasting emptiness. The gold was gone, spent or lost. The crew was dead. The ship was splintered. All that remained was the weight of what he'd done and the question of why he'd been spared when so many others had not. The sound of splashing drew his attention back to the present. Offshore, the Dolphins had returned, their sleek forms cutting through the calm water with effortless grace. They swam closer than before, approaching the shallows where Ezra stood among the wreckage of his former life. One of them, larger than the rest with distinctive scars along its dorsal fin, seemed to be watching him with unusual intensity. Ezra found himself speaking aloud for the first time since awakening on the island. "Why?" His voice cracked from disuse and emotion. "Why save me? I'm not worth saving." The scarred dolphin responded with a series of clicks and whistles that sounded almost like conversation. The creature's dark eyes held an intelligence that made Ezra uncomfortable, as if it could see into the depths of his soul and judge what it found there. More wreckage washed ashore as the morning progressed, each piece bringing Grain's memories of his life's destruction. A carved figurehead from the ship's bow, a crimson-painted woman whose face bore an unfortunate resemblance to his long-dead mother. Pieces of the ship's wheel that had guided him to countless acts of piracy. The ship's logbook, its pages swollen with seawater, but still legible enough to chronicle years of raids and murders. As Ezra sorted through the debris, he began to understand that this wasn't random chance. The Dolphins had brought him here for a reason, and now they were ensuring he faced the full weight of his past. Every piece of wreckage was a reminder, every barnacle-encrusted artifact a testament to the life he'd led. The cutlass grew heavier in his hands as the day wore on. By evening, as he sat by his fire with the weapon across his knees, Ezra realized he was being given a choice. He could cling to what he'd been, a killer, a thief, a man who took what he wanted by force. Or he could let that identity die with the crimson revenge. The Dolphins continued their vigil offshore, patient guardians waiting to see which path their rescued castaway would choose. In their presence, Ezra felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in decades. Shame, yes, but also the possibility of something beyond it. The question was whether a man like him could find redemption, or if some sins were too deep to ever wash clean. As darkness fell over the island, Ezra made his first decision. He walked to the water's edge and hurled the corrupted cutlass, as far as his aging arm could manage. The blade disappeared beneath the waves with barely a splash, taking with it the last symbol of Captain Blackwater's reign of terror. The dolphins sang in the distance, their voices carrying across the water like a promise he didn't yet understand. 3 days of exploration had revealed most of the island's secrets, but Ezra had avoided the sea-facing cliffs on the western shore. Something about their dark, weathered faces suggested danger, or perhaps secrets he wasn't ready to uncover. But his dwindling food supply and the need for better shelter finally drove him to investigate the rocky coastline. The cliffs were honeycombed with caves, carved by centuries of wind and wave action. Most were shallow affairs, little more than alcoves in the rock face, but one opening, hidden behind a curtain of flowering vines, seemed to extend deep into the island's heart. The scent that emerged from within was different, not the salt tang of sea caves, but something dry and preserved, like an old library. Ezra fashioned a torch from driftwood and dried grass, lighting it from his carefully maintained fire before venturing into the cave's mouth. The passage opened almost immediately into a spacious chamber that showed clear signs of human habitation. Someone had lived here for years, perhaps decades, transforming the natural cave into a comfortable dwelling. Stone shelves carved into the walls held an assortment of items that spoke of long solitude and careful preservation. Clay pots sealed with wax contained what appeared to be preserved foods, fruits and vegetables that should have rotted years ago, but remained edible. Fishing nets hung from wooden pegs, their repairs showing the patient work of someone with unlimited time and limited resources. But it was the desk that drew Ezra's attention, a simple wooden table positioned to catch the morning light from the cave's entrance. Upon it lay an open leather-bound journal, its pages covered in neat script written in Spanish. Beside the journal sat a wooden crucifix, carved with the same careful attention to detail that marked everything else in this sanctuary. Ezra could read Spanish well enough after years of raiding ships from New Spain. The journal's first entry was dated 37 years earlier and signed Fray Antonio Vasquez de Coronado, a monk then shipwrecked or marooned on this same island. The early entries spoke of despair and desperate attempts to signal for rescue. As Ezra read deeper into the journal, the monk's story unfolded like a map of spiritual transformation. Brother Antonio had been traveling from Mexico to Spain when his ship was attacked by English privateers. Left for dead in a damaged longboat, he had drifted for days before dolphins. The same dolphins, Ezra realized, had guided him to this island. The monk's initial rage and despair gradually gave way to acceptance, then wonder, and finally to a kind of peace that Ezra had never known existed. Brother Antonio wrote of conversations with the dolphins, of learning to read the island's natural rhythms, of discovering that this place existed outside the normal flow of worldly concern. The creatures of the deep brought me here not as punishment for my sins, one entry read, but as opportunity for my soul. They are guardians of this sacred place, choosing carefully those who might benefit from its solitude and grace. I begin to understand that I was not saved from drowning, but saved for something far more precious, the chance to discover who I might become when stripped of all worldly concerns. Later entries described the monk's attempts to understand the island's history. He had found the same stone carvings that Ezra had discovered, interpreting them as evidence of an ancient people who had recognized the dolphins' spiritual significance. The altar in the ruined village had been a place of thanksgiving, where rescued souls had offered gratitude for their salvation and transformation. Brother Antonio had lived on the island for 17 years before his journal entries ceased. His final writings spoke of complete contentment and a deep understanding of his purpose as the island's temporary guardian. He had prepared the cave as shelter for the next soul the dolphins might bring, stocking it with preserved food and fresh water, leaving behind the tools and knowledge necessary for survival. Whoever finds this journal, the final entry read, know that you were brought here with purpose. The dolphins do not rescue the innocent. They rescue the broken, the lost, the ones who have gotten their own capacity for good. This island strips away everything false, everything harmful, everything that prevents the soul from remembering its true nature. Do not fight this gift. Embrace it as I have learned to do. Ezra closed the journal with trembling hands. The monk's words seemed to have been written specifically for him, addressing questions he had barely begun to ask. Brother Antonio had faced the same disorientation, the same wondering about purpose and meaning. More importantly, he had found answers. The cave contained everything Ezra needed for extended survival. Better tools, preserved food, fresh water that seeped through the rock walls, and shelter from the tropical storms that would surely come. But more than that, it contained hope. If a man of God could find redemption on this island, perhaps even a pirate might discover grace. As Ezra settled into his new home, the dolphin songs echoed across the water outside, welcoming him to the next stage of his transformation. The monk's cave became Ezra's world as he settled into routines that Brother Antonio had perfected over 17 years of solitude. Dawn meant checking the water collection system that channeled rainwater into carved stone basins. Morning brought fishing from the rocky ledges, where the monk had discovered the richest feeding grounds. Afternoon meant tending the small garden Antonio had cultivated in pockets of soil between the rocks, where hardy vegetables somehow thrived in the salty air. But it was the evenings that proved most challenging. When the day's work was done, and Ezra sat alone with nothing but his thoughts and the sound of waves against stone. The dolphins maintained their presence in the waters below, their periodic appearances becoming a source of unexpected comfort. He found himself talking to them, sharing observations about the weather or discoveries he'd made while exploring the island. "Found coconut crabs in the eastern rocks today," he told them one evening, feeling only mildly foolish for addressing creatures that couldn't understand him. Brother Antonio was right about the best size for eating. The big ones are too tough, the small ones not worth the effort. The scarred dolphin he'd noticed before seemed to listen with particular attention, sometimes responding with soft clicks that almost sounded conversational. Ezra began to think of the creature as his confessor, a patient listener who heard his words without judgment. The isolation pressed against him like a physical weight. After decades of commanding crews and making decisions that affected dozens of men, the silence of solitude felt unnatural. Brother Antonio's journal spoke of this struggle too, the way loneliness could drive a man to madness if he let it, or toward deeper understanding if he found the courage to face it direct. To combat the crushing quiet, Ezra began projects that would have seemed beneath a pirate captain's dignity. Using techniques described in the monk's careful notes, he wove a fishing net from salvaged rope and vine fibre. The work required patience and precision, qualities his former life had never demanded. Pirates took what they needed through force and speed. This methodical crafting was something entirely different. The net took him 3 weeks to complete, his fingers learning the rhythm of over and under, weaving that created the strong, flexible mesh. When finished, it represented more than just a tool for catching fish. It was proof that his hands could create as well as destroy. The same fingers that had gripped cutlass and pistol could also weave and mend and build. Testing the net in the shallow lagoon proved its worth immediately. Fish that had been difficult to catch by hand or spear were easily gathered in the mesh. But more importantly, the act of fishing became a form of meditation. Standing waist deep in the clear water, watching for the telltale signs of schooling fish, Ezra found his mind quieting in ways it never had during his violent years. The dolphins approved of his fishing, or so it seemed. They would guide schools of fish toward his net, their intelligent eyes watching as he worked. Sometimes they would circle the area where he fished, as if protecting him from the reef sharks that occasionally wandered into the lagoon. "You're teaching me, aren't you?" Ezra asked them one morning as they performed their circular dance around his fishing spot. "Brother Antonio wrote about learning from you. I thought he meant learning to survive, but it's something more than that." The scarred dolphin approached closer than ever before, its rostrum breaking the surface just feet from where Ezra stood. For a moment, man and dolphin regarded each other in perfect stillness. In the creature's dark eye, Ezra saw something that reminded him of Elena Rodriguez, the Spanish merchant's daughter he'd loved and lost so many years ago. The same intelligence, the same gentle patience, the same capacity to see beyond surface appearances to whatever good might lie beneath. That night, as Ezra mended a tear in his net by firelight, he found himself speaking aloud again, not to the dolphins this time, but to the memory of Eleanor. She had died of fever while he was away on what would become his first act of piracy, never knowing that her beloved Ezra would transform into the feared Captain Blackwater. "I became everything you would have hated," he whispered to the flames. "Everything you tried to save me from becoming. But maybe it's not too late to remember who I was when you loved me." The net rested in his lap, its careful weaving a testament to patience and skill he'd never known he possessed. In its creation, Ezra had begun to understand what Brother Antonio meant about the island stripping away everything false. The violence, the anger, the need to dominate and control, all of it felt like costumes he'd worn for so long he'd forgotten they weren't his real skin. Outside the cave, the dolphins sang their evening song, and for the first time since awakening on this shore, Ezra felt something approaching peace. The storm arrived without warning, as Caribbean tempests often do. One moment Ezra was checking his fishing nets, in the afternoon calm. The next he was scrambling for shelter as walls of rain swept across the island like artillery barrages. The wind howled with a voice that reminded him of cannon fire, and lightning split the darkening sky with electric fury. His cave provided protection from the worst of it, but the storm's violence exceeded anything Brother Antonio had described in his journal. Water poured through cracks in the rock that had never leaked before, and the carefully maintained garden was stripped bare in minutes. Ezra huddled in the deepest part of the cave, listening to the island being torn apart by forces beyond human control. Through the storm's chaos, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the distressed calls of dolphins in trouble. The sounds were different from their usual songs, urgent and panicked. Without thinking, Ezra grabbed the monk's oil-soaked torch and fought his way toward the cave entrance, peering through the sheets of rain at the churning sea below. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark detail. The dolphins were trapped in the shallow lagoon, cut off from deeper water by debris the storm had torn from the island's interior. A massive tree, One of the ancient giants that had stood for centuries had been struck by lightning and fallen directly across the lagoon's entrance. Its burning trunk created a barrier that prevented the dolphins from reaching the safety of open ocean. The scarred dolphin that had become his silent companion was among them, thrashing weakly against the fallen tree. Something was wrong with its movement. One of its flippers appeared damaged, possibly broken by falling debris. The creature's distress calls cut through the storm's noise like a knife through Ezra's conscience. Without stopping to consider the danger, Ezra plunged into the storm. The rain struck him like physical blows, and the wind threatened to lift him off his feet. But he pushed forward toward the burning tree. The lightning-split trunk was massive, easily 4 feet in diameter, and parts of it still smoldered despite the soaking rain. The tree had fallen at an angle, creating a partial dam that trapped the dolphins in water too shallow for safety. If the storm surge receded, they would be stranded on dry land. If it didn't, the burning debris might poison the water that sustained them. Either way, they would die, unless someone moved the obstacle. Ezra had moved heavy cargo countless times during his pirate years, but always with help from his crew and proper equipment. Here he had only his aging strength and whatever tools he could improvise. The monk's cave contained rope and a block and tackle system. Antonio had salvaged from some long-ago wreck, but getting it down to the water in these conditions seemed impossible. Still, he had to try. The scarred dolphin's calls were growing weaker, and the others clustered around their injured companion with obvious distress. These creatures had saved his life when they had no obligation to do so. Now they needed him to return the fay fighting through wind that tried to knock him flat. Ezra rigged a pulley system using the salvaged tackle and a sturdy palm tree that still stood near the lagoon's edge. The rope was old but strong, and the pulleys, though corroded, still functioned. What he attempted was probably beyond the strength of one man, but desperation gave him power he didn't know he possessed. The first attempts failed completely. The tree was simply too heavy, too waterlogged, too firmly lodged against the rocks. But as Ezra strained against the rope, something unexpected happened. The dolphins began to help. Working together, they pushed against the trunk from the water side, while Ezra pulled from land, their combined efforts slowly shifting the massive obstacle. It took 3 hours of exhausting work, but finally the burning tree moved enough to create a passage. The dolphins shot through the gap like arrows released from a bow, racing for the deeper water beyond the reef. All except one. The scarred dolphin remained, floating motionless in the shallows, its injured flipper making swimming impossible. Without hesitation, Ezra waded into the churning water. The dolphin was larger than he'd realized, easily 300 pounds of solid muscle, but its eyes held the same trust he'd seen during their evening conversation. Carefully, gently, Ezra guided the injured creature toward the passage he'd created, supporting its weight until it reached water deep enough to swim. The scarred dolphin turned back once before disappearing into the storm-tossed sea, its dark eye meeting Ezra's for a moment that felt like a covenant. Then it was gone, following its pod to safety while Ezra collapsed on the beach, exhausted but strangely fulfilled. As the storm finally passed and dawn revealed the damage, Ezra found himself staring at the lightning-split tree. Half of it still burned stubbornly despite the rain, its destruction so complete that it could never live again. But its sacrifice had created something new, a passage between the lagoon and the sea that would benefit marine life for generations to come. Standing beside the split trunk, Ezra understood that some forms of death made new life possible. The storm's aftermath revealed changes to the island that went far beyond fallen trees and scattered debris. The violent winds and driving rain had stripped away layers of vegetation and sediment that had accumulated over decades, exposing sections of the ancient ruins that Ezra had never seen before. Where once there had been only moss-covered mounds, now stood the clear outlines of stone buildings, their walls reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue after the tempest's gray fury. Following a newly carved channel where runoff had gouged through the earth, Ezra discovered a section of the old settlement that the storm had literally unearthed. The buildings here were different from the circular foundations he'd found earlier. These were rectangular structures with careful masonry and decorative elements that spoke of a more sophisticated civilization than he'd imagined. In what appeared to have been a central plaza, the storm had revealed a collection of artifacts that made Ezra's breath catch in his throat. Scattered across the ancient stonework were dozens of Spanish gold coins, their surfaces green with age but still bearing the unmistakable marks of the royal mint. These were pieces of 8, the currency of empire, worth a fortune in any Caribbean port. But as Ezra knelt to examine the coins more closely, their presence began to make sense in a way that filled him with unease. These weren't randomly scattered treasure. They had been deliberately placed in patterns around the plaza's ceremonial spaces. Some formed circles around carved dolphin images, others were arranged in lines that pointed toward the altar he'd discovered on his first day of exploration. The coins told a story that Brother Antonio's journal had only hinted at. This hadn't been some isolated native settlement. It had been a refuge where Spanish shipwreck survivors had lived alongside the indigenous people, creating a unique community bound together by their shared rescue by the Dolphins. The gold represented offerings, gifts of gratitude from those who had been saved from death at sea. Among the coins, Ezra found other artifacts that painted a clearer picture of the island's history. Clay vessels bearing both Spanish and native design. Tools that showed European metalworking techniques adapted to local materials. Most significantly, a series of stone tablets, similar to the one he'd found by the stream. But these bore inscriptions in both Spanish and what appeared to be an indigenous script. The Spanish portions were readable, though the language was archaic. They spoke of La Isla de los Salvadores, the island of the saviors, and described the Dolphins as mensajeros de Dios, messengers of God. One tablet told the story of a Spanish treasure ship that had foundered in a storm, its survivors guided to safety by dolphins who seemed to understand their desperation. Here the lost find peace, one inscription read. Here the broken are made whole. Here those who have taken life learn to give it back. The guardians of the deep choose carefully those who come to this sacred shore. Let none who arrive in greed or anger remain. Let only those who seek redemption find rest. The words hit Ezra like physical blows. Every phrase seemed aimed directly at his heart, describing exactly what he had experienced since awakening on this beach. The Dolphins hadn't rescued him by chance. They had evaluated him, found him worthy of salvation despite his sins, and brought him here for purposes he was only beginning to understand. As he gathered some of the coins, Ezra realized he felt no desire to hoard them or calculate their value. In his previous life, such a discovery would have sent him into a frenzy of greed, planning how to transport the treasure and where to spend it. Now the gold felt heavy in his hands for different reasons. Each coin represented someone else's gratitude, someone else's transformation from despair to hope. The storm had revealed more than ancient buildings and scattered treasure. It had exposed the full scope of what this island represented, not just a place of survival, but a sanctuary where souls came to be rebuilt from the inside out. The indigenous people who had first recognized the Dolphins' spiritual significance, the Spanish survivors who had learned to see their rescue as divine intervention, Brother Antonio who had spent 17 years discovering his true nature, all of them had been part of the same ongoing story. And now Ezra was part of it too. That evening, as he sat by his fire with a handful of the ancient coins warming in his palm, Ezra understood what Brother Antonio had meant about embracing the gift of this place. The storm hadn't just revealed the island's secrets. It had revealed his own purpose. He wasn't here to escape his past or hide from the consequences of his actions. He was here to learn what it meant to give back more than he had taken. The scarred dolphin appeared in the calm waters below his cave, its injury apparently healed enough to allow normal swimming. When their eyes met across the water, Ezra held up one of the gold coins and then deliberately threw it into the sea, his first offering to the guardians who had saved his life. The dolphin's response was a sound he'd never heard before, musical and joyful, Like laughter carried on the wind. A month after the storm, the sea delivered another gift that nearly broke Ezra's carefully reconstructed peace. He was checking his nets in the early morning calm when he spotted something metallic glinting beneath the water near the reef. At first he thought it might be more debris from his ship, but as he swam closer, his heart clenched with recognition. It was the ship's bell from the Crimson Revenge, the bronze monument that had called his crew to battle stations and marked the hours of their shared adventures. Somehow the storm had torn it loose from whatever deep-sea grave had claimed his vessel and carried it back to haunt him with memories he'd been trying to leave behind. The bell was larger and heavier than Ezra remembered, requiring considerable effort to drag it at the shallow water to shore. Its bronze surface was encrusted with marine growth, but the inscription around its rim remained clearly visible. Crimson Revenge, Ezra Blackwater, Captain, in Brotherhood we trust. Below that, in smaller letters, were engraved the names of every man who had ever served aboard his ship. Ezra's fingers traced each name as if reading a catalogue of the damned. Miguel Santos, his first mate who could read the stars like scripture. Thomas Webb, barely 20 when a Spanish sword ended his dreams of returning to his sweetheart in Port Royal. William Red Morrison, whose booming laugh had once filled the ship's galley during their evening meals. 37 names in total, 37 lives that had ended because they'd followed Captain Blackwater into one final doomed battle. The weight of their memory crushed down on him like the depths of the ocean itself. These men hadn't been evil monsters. They'd been sailors trying to make their way in a world that offered few honest options for those born into poverty. Some had joined his crew to escape debts they couldn't pay. Others had been pressed into service by circumstances beyond their control. A few, like young Thomas, had simply been seduced by stories of adventure and easy gold. Ezra had been their leader, their captain, the man responsible for their safety and their choice. He'd led them into battle after battle, growing rich on their courage, while telling himself that piracy was just another form of war. But war had rules, codes of conduct that distinguished soldiers from murderers. Pirates answered to no flag but greed, served no cause but their own enrichment. Sitting beside the recovered bell as the sun climbed toward its zenith, Ezra found himself speaking to the names etched in bronze. "I'm sorry, Miguel. You warned me about that last prize," said the escort was too heavy. "But I wouldn't listen. I never listened when listening might have cost me gold." He moved to the next name. "Thomas, your Mary was waiting for you in Port Royal. You showed me her letter, remember? She was planning your wedding for when you came home with enough money to buy that little farm. I took that future away from you, for the sake of Spanish treasure that's now feeding the fish." One by one, Ezra spoke to each name, confessing sins he'd carried alone for too long. Some of the men had died in battle, victims of the violence that piracy inevitably brought. Others had perished from disease or accident during their years together, their deaths hastened by the harsh conditions of life at sea. All of them had trusted him to lead them to prosperity and safety, and he'd delivered them to death instead. The Dolphins had been watching from deeper water, but as Ezra's litany of grief continued, they began to move closer. The scarred dolphin that had become his confessor approached within arm's reach, its dark eyes reflecting the pain that Ezra couldn't hide. When he reached the final name on the bell, Roberto Flores, a boy from Tortuga, who died of fever 3 days out of port, his voice broke completely. "They followed me because they believed I could give them something better than the lives they'd known," Ezra whispered to the "Instead I gave them death and dishonor. Their families will never know what happened to them, never have graves to visit or prayers to say. They're just gone. Because of me." The scarred dolphin made a sound that might have been comfort, a soft whistle that seemed to acknowledge Ezra's pain without dismissing it. The creature's presence reminded him of something Brother Antonio had written about guilt and redemption. "We cannot undo the harm we have caused, but we can choose to ensure that our remaining days serve life rather than death." As the afternoon wore on, Ezra made a decision that felt both necessary and impossible. Using tools from the monk's cave, he began the delicate work of cleaning the ship's bell, removing decades of marine growth to restore its original bronze luster. The work was meditation and penance combined, each careful scrape of his knife revealing another letter, another name, another life he'd failed to protect. When the bell was finally clean, Ezra carried it to the highest point on the island, the ancient altar, where countless others had come to make their peace with forces greater than themselves. There, as the sun set over water that held too many secrets, he set up a memorial that would honor his lost crew while acknowledging his own responsibility for their fate. The bell would remain here, a reminder of lives that had mattered, dreams that had been cut short, and the terrible weight of leadership exercised without wisdom. Every sunset, Ezra would ring it once for each lost soul, ensuring that their names were spoken aloud and their memory preserved. It was the least he could do for the men who had trusted him with their lives and received death in return. The Dolphins' behavior began to change after Ezra established the memorial bell, where once they had simply watched and occasionally interacted. Now they seemed to be testing him in ways that went beyond mere observation. It started small, schools of fish driven toward his nets, then deliberately led away when he had more than he needed for a single meal. The message was clear: take only what you require, leave the rest for others. But the tests grew more complex as days passed. One morning, Ezra found a young sea turtle tangled in debris that had washed ashore during the night. The creature was exhausted from its struggle, barely alive, but still valuable. Turtle meat could sustain him for days, and the shell would make useful tools. His old pirate instincts whispered of practical benefits, of survival priorities that made sentiment a luxury he couldn't afford. The scarred dolphin watched from just beyond the shallows as Ezra knelt beside the trapped turtle. In the creature's dark eye, Ezra saw the weight of choice. This wasn't about survival. His fishing had been successful, his food stores adequate. This was about what kind of man he was becoming. Carefully, patiently, Ezra freed the turtle from the tangled rope and plastic that had nearly killed it. The creature was larger than he'd initially thought, probably decades old, its shell marked with the scars of a long life in dangerous waters. When he carried it to deeper water and released it, the turtle paused for a moment, as if gathering strength, then swam toward the reef with powerful strokes that spoke of renewed life. The dolphins responded with what could only be described as celebration. They leaped and spun in the water, their calls creating a symphony of approval that echoed off the island's cliffs. But their joy felt earned rather than given, as if Ezra had passed some crucial examination. More tests followed. A pod of young dolphins, separated from their mothers during a storm, appeared in the lagoon looking lost and frightened. Ezra could have ignored them, let nature take its course. But instead he spent 3 days guiding them to deeper water, where their calls could carry farther. When the mothers finally arrived, their reunion was so joyful that Ezra found tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The dolphins began bringing him gifts in return: unusual shells, pieces of coral shaped like flowers, even small treasures from shipwrecks he'd never seen. But the most significant gift came on a morning when the scarred dolphin approached the shallows carrying something in its mouth that made Ezra's heart skip. It was a necklace of black pearls, perfectly matched and strung on gold wire, so fine it seemed almost ethereal. Ezra recognized it immediately. He'd stolen it from the cabin of a Spanish merchant ship 3 years earlier. The pearls had belonged to the merchant's daughter, a young woman who'd wept when her jewelry was taken. Ezra had kept the necklace because of its beauty and value, but also because something about the girl's tears had haunted him. Now the dolphins were returning it to him, but not as a gift to keep. The scarred dolphin placed the necklace on the beach and retreated, watching expectantly. The message was unmistakable. This was another test, perhaps the most important one yet. Ezra picked up the pearl necklace with trembling hands, feeling the weight of memory and moral choice. In his pirate days, he would have seen this as a sign of good fortune, a valuable prize reclaimed from the sea. But now he understood what the dolphins wanted him to do. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra carried the pearl necklace to the ancient altar where he'd placed his crew's memorial bell. He held the jewelry up to catch the dying light, remembering the Spanish girl's tears, remembering the casual cruelty with which he'd taken something precious from someone who'd done him no harm. "This belongs to Isabella Santos," he said aloud, speaking to the Dolphins who had gathered in unusual numbers to witness this moment. "Daughter of merchant Captain Diego Santos, stolen from her cabin aboard the Santa Maria 3 years past. I took it because I could, because her tears meant nothing to me then." Ezra held the necklace over the altar's stone surface, then slowly lowered it into a carved depression that seemed designed for such offerings. "I cannot return it to her directly, but I can ensure it never again serves greed or cruelty. Let it rest here as a reminder of harm I cannot undo, and as a promise to do better with whatever time remains to me." The moment the pearls touched the ancient stone, something extraordinary happened. The altar itself seemed to pulse with soft light, and the Dolphins began a song unlike any Ezra had heard before. It was mournful and joyful simultaneously, a sound that spoke of redemption earned through sacrifice, of forgiveness that came not as gift, but as consequence of genuine change. The scarred dolphin approached the shore one more time that night, rising halfway out of the water to look directly into Ezra's eyes. In that gaze, Ezra saw acceptance, recognition, and something that might have been respect. The creature had been testing him, and he had finally proven worthy of trust. From that night forward, Ezra understood that he was no longer just a castaway learning to survive. He was an apprentice guardian, being prepared for responsibilities he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The Dolphins had found him worthy of their sacred mission, whatever that might prove to be. Loneliness struck Ezra in waves as powerful as any storm. Despite the Dolphins' acceptance and the island's beauty, the absence of human conversation began to weigh on him like a physical burden. He found himself talking to the wind, to the fish in his nets, to the memories that walked beside him through the ruins of the ancient settlement. In desperation, he began crafting messages in bottles, using glass containers he'd found among Brother Antonio's supplies. The monk had collected them over the years, perhaps for the same purpose that now drove Ezra, the need to reach beyond isolation toward some form of human connection, however remote. The first message was simple, almost childlike in its honesty. "My name is Ezra Blackwater. I am alive on an island somewhere in the Caribbean. If you find this, know that a man who did terrible things is trying to learn how to do better." He sealed it with wax from the monk's candles and held it for hours before realizing he couldn't bring himself to throw it into the sea. The bottle sat on his table for days, while Ezra wrestled with the implications of sending such a message. What if it was found by someone who recognized his name? Captain Blackwater was wanted by every civilized government in the Caribbean. His crimes carried death sentences in Port Royal, Havana, and Cartagena. A message like this could bring hunters to his sanctuary, endangering not just himself, but the sacred nature of this place. The second message was more cautious. "I was a merchant sailor once, before I lost my way. Now I tend a garden on an island, where dolphins bring the lost to find themselves again. If you are lost too, perhaps the sea will guide you to peace, as it guided me." But this felt false, a sanitized version of his story that honored neither his victims nor his genuine transformation. Night after night, Ezra wrote messages he couldn't send, each one an attempt to bridge the gap between his terrible past and uncertain future. Some were confessions to crimes that would never see a courtroom. Others were letters to the families of men he'd killed, words that could never reach their intended recipients but needed to be written anyway. To the widow of Captain Hernando Valdez, he wrote by candlelight, "Your husband died defending his ship with honor. I took his life in greed and anger, and I cannot give it back. But I swear by all that is sacred that I will spend my remaining days ensuring that no other woman loses her husband to the violence I once embraced." The messages accumulated like a paper monument to regret and hope. Bottles filled with words too dangerous to send, too important to destroy. Ezra found the writing process strangely healing, as if putting his thoughts into physical form somehow lessened their power to torment him. Each letter was a conversation with parts of himself he'd buried under years of violence and cynicism. Some messages were addressed to Eleanor Rodriguez, the woman he'd loved before his transformation into Captain Blackwater. "Mi querida Eleanor," he would begin, then pour out the story of what he'd become after her death. How grief had twisted into rage, how rage had hardened into a way of life that would have horrified her gentle soul. "You died believing I was good," he wrote in one particularly painful letter. "You never knew that your Ezra would become a killer, a thief, a man who brought terror wherever he went. I cannot ask for your forgiveness, because I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that I remember who I was when you loved me, and I am trying to find my way back to that man." Other messages were meant for his crew, explanations and apologies that could never reach men who lay beneath Caribbean waters. He wrote to Miguel about the pride that had prevented him from taking his first mate's wise counsel. He wrote to young Thomas about the dreams that had been cut short for the sake of Spanish gold. Each letter was both penance and preparation, helping him understand the weight of leadership and the responsibility that came with second chances. The Dolphins watched his nightly writing sessions with what seemed like approval. Sometimes the scarred dolphin would approach the shallows as Ezra worked by lamplight, its presence a reminder that witnessing pain was itself a form of communion. The creature never interrupted, never demanded attention, simply offered the comfort of shared solitude. As the collection of unsent messages grew, Ezra began to understand their true purpose. They weren't meant to be sent. They were meant to be written. Each bottle represented a step in his journey from the man who had destroyed lives toward the man who might someday save them. The writing taught him the difference between remorse and self-pity, between genuine accountability and empty guilt. His victims deserved more than his tears. They deserved a commitment to ensure that his future actions honored their memory rather than merely mourning their loss. On the night he finished his 50th unsent message, Ezra looked out at the moonlit sea and felt something shift inside him. The need to send the messages had faded, replaced by understanding that the important conversation was the one he'd been having with himself all along. The ship appeared on the horizon at dawn, its silhouette dark against the rising sun. Ezra spotted it from his morning fishing spot and felt his blood turn to ice water. After months of solitude, the sight of human civilization should have brought joy. But something about the vessel's purposeful approach toward his sanctuary filled him with dread. Through Brother Antonio's spyglass, which the monk had somehow acquired during his years on the island, Ezra studied the approaching ship with growing alarm. It flew no flag, carried too many guns for honest commerce, and rode low in the water with the weight of human cargo. This was a slaver, one of the cursed vessels that traded in human misery across the Caribbean shipping lanes. But something was wrong with the ship's course. Instead of the steady progress of a vessel under full control, it wallowed and yawed as if undermanned or damaged. Smoke rose from somewhere amidships, and even at this distance, Ezra could hear the faint sounds of conflict carrying across the water. As the ship drew closer, the situation became clearer. This was a slave revolt in progress. The human cargo fighting desperately for freedom while their captors struggled to maintain control. Bodies floated in the ship's wake, evidence of the violence that had already claimed lives on both sides of the conflict. Ezra's first instinct was pure self-preservation. Whatever happened aboard that ship was not his concern. He could retreat to the interior of the island, hide until the vessel passed, and avoid any entanglement with the outside world that might compromise his sanctuary. The old Captain Blackwater would have made such calculations without hesitation, but the man he was becoming couldn't simply watch human beings fight and die within sight of his shore. When a section of the ship's rail collapsed and several figures tumbled into the sea, Ezra found himself running toward his dugout canoe before conscious thought could override moral instinct. The water around the ship was chaos. Drowning people cried out in multiple languages: Spanish, Portuguese, and African tongues Ezra couldn't identify, but whose desperation needed no translation. Bodies floated lifelessly, while others struggled against chains that dragged them toward the depth. The captain and crew were nowhere to be seen, perhaps already dead or fled in whatever boats the ship had carried. 3 people were still alive in the water when Ezra reached them, a woman and 2 men, all bearing the marks of recent violence and long captivity. Their skin showed the welts and scars of brutal treatment, but their eyes still held the fire of those who had chosen to fight for freedom rather than accept bondage. Getting them into his small canoe required careful maneuvering and considerable trust on their part. They had no way of knowing whether this lone rescuer represented salvation or simply another form of captivity. But desperation overcame caution, and soon Ezra was paddling toward shore with 3 escaped slaves who watched him with the wariness of people who had learned that white men's intentions were rarely benevolent. The woman spoke first, her Spanish accented but clear. "You are alone here, yes. This island, it's safe. The people who lived here before, they understood sanctuary." The older of the 2 men studied Ezra's face with intelligent eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Why help us? What do you want in return?" It was a reasonable question. In the world these people knew, nothing came without a price, especially aid from white men who found Africans in the water. Ezra considered his answer carefully, knowing that trust would have to be earned through actions rather than words. "I want nothing except to see you live free. This island has taught me that some opportunities for good must not be wasted." That first night, as his unexpected guests recovered their strength around a carefully tended fire, Ezra learned their names and stories. Maria had been captured during a raid on her village in Angola, sold to Portuguese traders, and shipped to the Caribbean to work sugar plantations until death freed her from bondage. Samuel and Joseph were brothers, torn from their family in what had once been their homeland, and forced into the nightmare of the Middle Passage. Their stories made Ezra's past crimes seem almost quaint by comparison. He had killed for gold and glory, but these people had suffered for the color of their skin and the accident of geography that had placed them within reach of slave raiders. Their courage in fighting for freedom humbled him and clarified his understanding of what true bravery looked like. As they spoke around the fire, Maria produced something that made Ezra's breath catch a conch shell, beautifully carved with symbols that matched those he'd found throughout the island's ruins. She had carried it through capture, transport, and escape, risking everything to preserve this connection to her lost home. "My grandmother gave this to me," she explained, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns. She said it could call the spirits of the sea, ask them for protection and guidance. "I used it tonight when the ship was burning and we were drowning. I called to whatever gods might be listening." Ezra looked out at the moonlit water where dolphins moved like silver ghosts through the gentle waves. "I think they heard you," he said softly, "and I think they brought you exactly where you needed to be." The 3 survivors brought more than their stories to Ezra's island. They brought skills, perspectives, and a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for survival against impossible odds. Over the following weeks, what had been a solitary sanctuary began to transform into something resembling a community. Maria proved to be a master of herbal medicine, her knowledge gleaned from generations of healers in her African homeland. She identified plants growing wild on the island that could treat wounds, reduce fever, and ease pain. Under her guidance, Ezra's simple survival garden expanded into something approaching a pharmacy, with carefully tended plots of medicinal herbs that could sustain not just their current group, but others who might arrive in need of healing. Samuel had been a metalworker before his capture, and he set about creating tools that made their daily lives easier and more productive. Using techniques that blended African craftsmanship with materials salvaged from various shipwrecks, he fashioned fishing spears, cooking implements, and even a primitive forge that allowed them to repair and improve their equipment. Joseph's gift was language. He spoke 6 different tongues fluently and could communicate basic ideas in a dozen more. This skill proved invaluable when they discovered they weren't the first escaped slaves to reach the island. Hidden in the ruins of the ancient settlement, Joseph found carved messages in scripts that predated even Brother Antonio's occupation, messages left by other refugees who had found temporary safety on these shores. But it was their questions about the future that forced Ezra to confront the limitations of his isolation. These three people had risked everything for freedom, only to find themselves trapped on an island with no clear path forward. They couldn't remain hidden forever, and they couldn't return to the world that had enslaved them without papers proving their free status. In Cuba, in Jamaica, in all the Spanish territories, we are property until we can prove otherwise, Maria explained. One evening as they shared a meal around their fire, without freedom papers, any white man can claim us and drag us back to the plantation. The solution came to Ezra gradually, born from his years of experience with forged documents and false identities. Pirates had always needed papers that would allow them to enter ports, sell goods, and avoid immediate arrests. Ezra had become skilled at creating convincing forgeries, though he'd always used that talent for criminal purposes. Now he saw a way to use those same skills for something honorable. Working by candlelight with materials salvaged from various sources, Ezra began crafting freedom papers for his three companions. The documents would identify them as freed slaves who had purchased their liberty, complete with official-looking seals and signatures that could pass casual inspection in most Caribbean ports. The work was painstaking and dangerous. If the forgeries were detected, they would all face severe punishment, execution for Ezra, return to slavery, or worse for the others. But the alternative was permanent exile from the human world, and Ezra had learned that isolation, however peaceful, was not the same as redemption. Samuel watched the document creation process with fascination and growing understanding. "You have done this before," he observed. "But not for people like us." Ezra nodded, not trying to hide his criminal past. "I forged papers to help pirates escape justice. Now I'm forging papers to help good people find it." The freedom papers took on symbolic weight beyond their practical value. Each carefully crafted letter represented a choice to use criminal skills for legitimate purposes, to transform tools of deception into instruments of liberation. Maria, Samuel, and Joseph were not just receiving documents. They were witnessing the completion of Ezra's transformation from destroyer to protector. But creating the papers was only the first step. The documents needed to be believable, not just in their appearance, but in their stories. Ezra worked with each person to construct a plausible history that would explain their presence in the Caribbean as free individuals rather than escaped slaves. Maria would be a healer from a community of free blacks in Mexico, traveling to seek medicinal plants unique to different islands. Samuel would be a freedman craftsman whose former master had taught him metalworking before granting him liberty in his will. Joseph would be a translator and guide, educated by missionaries and working for merchants who needed someone who could communicate with diverse populations. The stories had to be simple enough to remember under questioning, but detailed enough to satisfy curiosity. They rehearsed them around the fire until each person could recite their false history with the confidence of truth. As the forged freedom papers neared completion, Ezra realized he was creating more than documents. He was creating new identities for people who had been stripped of their original names, families, and homes. In giving them papers that would allow them to move freely through the world, he was returning to them something precious that slavery had stolen: the right to determine their own destiny. The finished documents were works of art in their own way, convincing enough to fool most officials, and complete enough to give their bearers confidence in their new identity. But more importantly, they represented proof that the skills Ezra had used for destruction could be redirected toward creation and hope. When he handed the completed freedom papers to each of his companions, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced since his transformation began: the deep satisfaction of using his abilities to serve justice rather than undermine it. The British naval vessel appeared 3 weeks after the Freedom Papers were completed, its Union Jack snapping in the Caribbean breeze as it anchored beyond the reef. Through Brother Antonio's spyglass, Ezra watched longboats being lowered with the methodical precision that marked professional military operations. These weren't merchants or pirates. This was His Majesty's Navy, and they had come looking for something specific. Ezra's blood turned cold when he recognized the ship's captain through the lens. Commander William Ashford had been hunting Captain Blackwater for 7 years, ever since Ezra's crew had attacked a British merchant convoy off the coast of Jamaica. Ashford's younger brother had died in that raid, cut down while defending a cargo of sugar and rum that had made Ezra rich for exactly 3 months. The wanted poster that Ashford's men nailed to a palm tree near the beach confirmed Ezra's worst fears. His own face stared back at him from the yellowed paper, albeit a younger, harder version with eyes that held no mercy. Captain Ezra Blackwater, the poster read, wanted for piracy, murder, and crimes against the Crown. Reward, £500. Dead or alive, Maria, Samuel, and Joseph had hidden themselves in the island's interior at Ezra's insistence, taking their forged freedom papers and enough supplies to survive for several days. But Ezra knew that hiding wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. If Ashford suspected that Captain Blackwater was on this island, he would search every cave, every ruin, every possible hiding place until he found what he was looking for. The first boat landed with 6 armed Marines who immediately began setting up a perimeter around the beach. They moved with the efficiency of men who had conducted similar operations many times before. Commander Ashford followed in the second boat, his uniform crisp, despite the tropical heat, his bearing that of a man who had never forgotten an injury or forgiven an enemy. Ezra watched from concealment as the naval party split into search teams. They had maps. He realized detailed charts that showed not just the island's coastline, but its interior features. Someone had provided them with intelligence about this place, perhaps from survivors of other expeditions or ships that had passed close enough to take bearings. As the search progressed, Ezra faced the most difficult decision of his transformed life. He could remain hidden, hope that the naval party would conclude their search without finding either him or his companions, and preserve the sanctuary that had become so precious to all of them. Or he could surrender himself, drawing attention away from the others while accepting whatever justice the British Navy chose to deliver. The choice became urgent when one of the search teams discovered the memorial bell on the island's highest point. Through his spyglass, Ezra watched Commander Ashford examine the bronze artifact with growing recognition. The officer's face went white when he read the engraved names, understanding immediately that he had found evidence of the Crimson Revenge's final crew. Ashford shouted orders that carried across the water, and the search intensified. They had confirmed that Captain Blackwater had been here, and now they were determined to find either the man himself or his body. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the cave, the garden, the other signs of recent habitation. That evening, as the naval party made camp on the beach with sentries posted around their perimeter, Ezra made his choice. He spent the night writing one final message. This one meant to be found rather than hidden. Using paper from Brother Antonio's supplies and his finest penmanship, he composed what amounted to a confession and a plea. To Commander William Ashford, HMS Resolute, he began. I am Captain Ezra Blackwater, and I surrender myself to your custody. I have committed the crimes for which I am wanted, including the attack on your convoy in which your brother died. I cannot bring him back, but I can ensure that no other families suffer as yours has suffered. The letter continued with specific details about his transformation on the island, his understanding of the harm he had caused, and his commitment to using whatever time remained to him in service of justice, rather than piracy. He described the island's sacred nature, its role as sanctuary for the lost and broken, and his plea that it be left undisturbed for others who might need its healing power. Most importantly, he made no mention of Maria, Samuel, and Joseph. As far as anyone reading the letter would know, Ezra had been alone on the island since his ship was destroyed. At dawn, Ezra walked it down to the beach carrying a white cloth tied to a piece of driftwood, the universal signal of surrender. The wanted poster was tucked into his shirt, evidence of his identity that would prevent any confusion about who was giving himself up. Commander Ashford met him at the water's edge, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The officer's face showed the controlled anger of a man who had finally cornered his quarry after years of hunting. "Captain Blackwater," Ashford said, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss and professional duty. "Just Ezra now," the former pirate replied, holding out his hands for the shackles he knew were coming. "I am no longer the man who killed your brother, but I am ready to pay for his crimes." As the cold iron closed around his wrists, Ezra felt something unexpected, not despair but a kind of peace. The dolphins sang in the distance, their voices carrying across the water, like a promise that some forms of redemption required the ultimate sacrifice. The shackles had barely closed around Ezra's wrists when the dolphins began their attack. It started as a disturbance in the water beyond the reef, dark shapes moving with deadly purpose toward the anchored HMS Resolute. Commander Ashford's men noticed it first, a sailor pointing toward the sea and shouting warnings that were lost in the sudden chaos of the dolphins' assault. But this wasn't the gentle spiritual guidance Ezra had come to know. This was something primal and fierce, dozens of dolphins working in coordinated patterns to disable the British warship. They struck the hull in synchronized waves, their powerful bodies hitting the wooden planks with sounds like cannon fire. The ship's anchor chains snapped under repeated impacts, and the vessel began to drift toward the reef where the coral would tear out her bottom. Commander Ashford stared in disbelief as his carefully planned operation dissolved into maritime disaster. "What in God's name?" he began, but his words were cut off by shouts from the longboat still in the water. The dolphins had turned their attention to the smaller craft, ramming them with precision that suggested intelligence rather than animal instinct. Marines who moments before had been confident in their victory now found themselves swimming for shore as their boats splintered around them. The dolphins herded them toward the beach like sheep, their movements coordinated and purposeful. But they harmed no one who didn't threaten their sanctuary, a restraint that spoke of wisdom rather than mere predatory behavior. From his position on the beach, Ezra watched in amazement as the creatures he'd come to revere revealed themselves as guardians in the most literal sense. They were protecting the island, protecting him, and protecting the sacred nature of this place with a ferocity he'd never imagined they possessed. "Call them off," Ashford demanded, his sword drawn but useless against opponents who lived in an element he couldn't enter. "Control your beasts." "They're not my beasts," Ezra replied, his voice carrying wonder, despite his desperate situation. "They're the guardians of this place, and you've violated something sacred." The battle, if it could be called that, continued for 2 hours. The HMS Resolute ran aground on the reef, exactly as the dolphins had intended, her hull torn open by coral that had been growing in these waters since before Columbus sailed. The crew managed to reach shore, but their ship was lost, along with their weapons, supplies, and any hope of immediate departure. As the reality of their situation became clear, Commander Ashford's military bearing began to crack. He was stranded on a hostile island with 30 men, no ship, limited supplies, and an enemy who commanded forces beyond human understanding. The neat military operation had become a survival scenario that no amount of training could have prepared him for. That evening, as the British sailors huddled around fires on the beach and contemplated their predicament, Ezra made an offer that surprised everyone, himself included. "I'll help you build a signal fire," he told Ashford, "something large enough to attract passing ships, and I'll share what I know about surviving on this island." "Why?" Ashford demanded. "You're my prisoner. These creatures have given you the upper hand. Why offer assistance?" Ezra considered the question seriously. The old Captain Blackwater would have seen this as an opportunity for revenge, a chance to watch his enemies suffer as he had once made others suffer. But the man he'd become understood that cycles of vengeance served no one's interest. Because your men don't deserve to die for your hunt, and because this island has taught me that survival is better achieved through cooperation than conflict. From his pocket, Ezra pulled a piece of white cloth that he'd torn from his shirt during the chaos, the same makeshift flag of surrender he'd used to approach the British force. But now he offered it with different intent. This represents something more than surrender, he explained, holding the cloth toward Ashford. It represents truce. Your ship is destroyed. Your mission has failed, and we're all castaways now. We can spend whatever time we have here fighting each other, or we can work together to survive until rescue comes. Ashford stared at the white cloth for a long moment, his military mind calculating odds and options. Around them, his men watched with the desperate hope of people who understood that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. What guarantee do I have that you won't try to escape, or that those creatures won't attack us again? You have my word, Ezra replied simply, and the Dolphins will leave you alone as long as you don't threaten this sanctuary or the people it protects. Slowly, reluctantly, Commander Ashford reached out and grasped the white cloth, accepting the truce that might be the only thing standing between his men and death on a remote Caribbean island. In that moment, the former pirate and the naval officer found themselves bound together by circumstances neither had anticipated, forced to discover whether enemies could become allies when survival demanded it. The truce between former enemies proved more transformative than either man had anticipated. Over the following weeks, as they worked together to establish a sustainable camp for the stranded sailors, Commander Ashford began to see glimpses of the man Ezra had become rather than the pirate he had been. The process of building shelter, finding food, and organizing their small community required cooperation that gradually broke down the barriers of mutual hatred. Ezra's knowledge of the island proved invaluable. He showed Ashford's men which plants were safe to eat, where to find fresh water, and how to construct shelters that would withstand tropical storms. More importantly, he demonstrated a leadership style based on service rather than dominance, earning respect through competence and fairness rather than fear. The British sailors, initially suspicious of their former quarry, began to trust Ezra's guidance as their situation improved under his advice. When young midshipman Collins developed a fever that threatened to turn fatal, it was Ezra who brought Maria from her hiding place to treat the boy with herbal medicines that British naval medicine couldn't provide. Maria's appearance shocked Commander Ashford, who immediately demanded explanations about escaped slaves harboring on his island. But when he saw her gently nursing Collins back to health with knowledge that saved the boy's life, his objections transformed into grudging respect. "She's a free woman," Ezra explained, producing the carefully forged papers he'd created. "All three of them are. They were traveling when their ship was attacked by slavers. The Dolphins brought them here, just as they brought me." Ashford examined the freedom papers with the eye of someone accustomed to identifying forgeries, but Ezra's work was flawless. More importantly, the commander found himself reluctant to challenge documents that protected people who were clearly helping his men survive. As the weeks passed, Samuel and Joseph emerged from hiding to contribute their own skills to the growing community. Samuel's metalworking abilities helped repair tools and weapons damaged by seawater, while Joseph's linguistic talents proved essential for communication when the group encountered other castaways who washed ashore from various maritime disasters. The island was becoming what it had always been intended to be, a sanctuary where people of different backgrounds worked together for mutual survival and benefit. The ancient ruins seemed to approve, and the Dolphins returned to their gentle presence now that the immediate threat to their sanctuary had passed. It was during a quiet evening, as Ezra and Ashford sat by the fire, discussing plans for a more permanent signal structure, that the commander finally asked the question that had been haunting him since his arrival. "Why did you surrender? You could have remained hidden, let us search fruitlessly and depart. The Dolphins would have protected you." Ezra was carving a wooden cross from driftwood, his hands moving with the patience he'd learned during his months of solitude. The simple religious symbol was meant for young Collins, who had asked for something to remind him of home during his recovery. "Because hiding from the past doesn't change it," Ezra replied, his knife carefully shaping the crosspiece. "I killed your brother, Commander. That fact doesn't disappear because I've learned to be a better man. Justice requires acknowledgement, even when forgiveness might be possible." Ashford watched the careful carving work, noting the reverence with which Ezra shaped the sacred symbol. "And do you believe forgiveness is possible for someone who has done what you've done?" Ezra held up the wooden cross, examining its proportions in the firelight. "I believe redemption is earned through service, not granted through absolution. Every day I spend helping others survive, protecting the innocent, building rather than destroying. That's how a man pays for his sins, not through death, but through life lived in service to something greater than himself." The cross was simple but beautiful, carved with the skill of someone who had found peace in the rhythm of honest work. When Ezra handed it to Collins the next morning, the young midshipman's tears of gratitude were matched by something unexpected in Commander Ashford's eyes. The beginning of understanding. That afternoon, Ashford made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He formally released Ezra from custody, acknowledging that the man before him was no longer the pirate he had hunted for so many years. "Captain Blackwater is dead," Ashford announced to his assembled men. "He died when his ship went down. The man who stands before us now is Ezra, guardian of this sanctuary, and he has my protection as long as he continues to serve the cause of justice rather than piracy." The wooden cross became a symbol of more than young Collins's faith. It represented the possibility of transformation, the power of service to change even the most hardened hearts, and the understanding that justice sometimes looked different than vengeance. As Ezra placed the cross in a place of honor near their communal fire, he felt the final chains of his past identity fall away. He was no longer a pirate seeking redemption, but a guardian who had found his true purpose. Word of the Sanctuary Islands spread through the Caribbean like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The rescue of Commander Ashford's crew by a passing merchant vessel became a story told in every port from Kingston to Cartagena, though the details grew more fantastical with each telling. Some spoke of an island protected by supernatural dolphins, others described a former pirate who had become a holy man. All agreed that somewhere in the vast Caribbean lay a place where the lost could find sanctuary. The first intentional seekers arrived 3 months after Ashford's departure. A small boat carrying a Spanish deserter who had fled his military post rather than participate in the brutal suppression of a native uprising. The Dolphins guided his damaged craft to the island's natural harbor, where Ezra waited with fresh water and the understanding that came from his own experience of seeking refuge from an unbearable past. More followed in the weeks and months that came after. A Portuguese merchant who had lost everything to pirates and couldn't bear to return home in shame. 2 French sailors who had jumped ship rather than participate in the slave trade. A Dutch woman who had disguised herself as a man to escape an arranged marriage, only to find herself stranded when her deception was discovered. Each arrival brought new challenges and new opportunities for the growing community. Ezra established protocols for evaluating newcomers, drawing on wisdom gained from Brother Antonio's journal and his own observations of the Dolphins' selection criteria. Not everyone who sought the island was granted permanent sanctuary. Those who came seeking easy wealth or refuge from justice without genuine remorse were gently but firmly directed elsewhere. But those who arrived with broken hearts and genuine desire for transformation found welcome and opportunity for healing. The community grew organically, with each new member contributing skills and perspectives that strengthened the whole. They built more permanent structures using techniques that blended the various traditions represented among them. They developed systems for agriculture, fishing, and crafts that made the settlement increasingly self-sufficient. As the island's reputation spread, Ezra realized the need for something he had never possessed during his pirate years, a clear moral compass that could guide difficult decisions. Working with Maria, Samuel, Joseph, and the other permanent residents, he developed a set of principles that would govern their sanctuary. The document they created was part constitution, part spiritual covenant, and part practical guide for community living. Ezra inscribed it carefully on parchment salvaged from various shipwrecks, using ink made from island plants and his finest calligraphy to ensure it would endure. The star chart he drew at the document's head showed not just celestial navigation points, but the spiritual coordinates that guided souls to sanctuary. La Carta de los Salvados, the Charter of the Saved, began with words that reflected everything Ezra had learned about redemption and responsibility. We who have been rescued from the depths, whether of water or of despair, commit ourselves to the service of those who come after us, seeking the same salvation we have found. The Charter established clear principles. No one would be turned away who came in genuine need of sanctuary. No one would be forced to remain who wished to leave. All would contribute according to their abilities, and receive according to their needs. Disputes would be settled through counsel rather than force. The island's natural beauty and spiritual significance would be protected for future generations. Most importantly, the Charter established the role of guardians, those who had completed their own transformation and accepted responsibility for guiding others through the same process. Ezra was named the first guardian, but provision was made for others to assume that role as they demonstrated the wisdom and compassion necessary for such responsibility. The star chart that adorned the Charter was more than decoration. It was a practical guide that showed how to find the island for those who might need sanctuary. But the navigational information was coded in symbols that would be meaningless to treasure hunters or those seeking the island for exploitation. Only those who understood the spiritual significance of the Dolphins' guidance would be able to interpret the chart correctly. As word of the Charter spread among the Caribbean's networks of escaped slaves, deserters and others seeking new lives, the island began to attract a different kind of visitor. Ships would approach the reef flying white flags, their captains asking permission to land passengers who needed sanctuary. Some of these vessels were commanded by men who had themselves been transformed by encounters with the island's guardians. The Charter became a beacon of hope in a world where second chances were rare and redemption seemed impossible for those who had fallen farthest from grace. Copies were made and carried by travelers who understood their significance, spreading the word that somewhere in the vast Caribbean, mercy was possible for those brave enough to seek it. Standing beside the memorial bell on the island's highest point, holding the original charter in hands that had once gripped cutlass and pistol in anger, Ezra understood that his transformation was complete. Not because his past had been erased, but because his future had been claimed for purposes greater than himself. 15 years had passed since the Dolphins first carried Ezra Blackwater to this sanctuary shore. His hair had turned completely white. His face bore the deep lines of a man who had lived through transformation and found peace, and his hands, once quick with cutlass and pistol, now moved with the careful deliberation of age. But his eyes still held the clarity of purpose that had sustained him through his long journey from destroyer to protector. The island thrived under the guidance of multiple guardians now. Maria had become the keeper of healing wisdom, teaching others the herbal arts she had learned in Africa and refined through years of island practice. Samuel oversaw the workshops where metal, wood and stone were shaped into tools that served life rather than death. Joseph managed the complex network of communication that connected their sanctuary to other safe havens throughout the Caribbean. The community had grown to nearly 200 souls, representing every nation and background that sailed these waters. Former slaves worked alongside reformed pirates. Spanish deserters shared meals with Dutch merchants, and children who had been born on the island played games that blended traditions from around the world. It was the kind of place that existed nowhere else in the Caribbean, a society built on the principle that redemption was possible for anyone willing to embrace it. On this particular morning, as Ezra made his way slowly to the memorial bell for his daily sunset ritual, he carried with him a flat stone tablet that represented the culmination of his life's work. Unlike the ancient carvings he had found when first exploring the island, this one bore names and stories inscribed in his own careful hand, a record of every soul who had found sanctuary on these shores. The memorial stone had grown over the years as Ezra painstakingly recorded the story of each arrival. Some entries were brief. Marcus Webb, merchant sailor, arrived 1747, found peace, departed 1749 to reunite with family. Others were more complex. Isabella Santos escaped slavery, arrived 1748, learned reading and writing, now teaches Turchin in Jamaica. Each name represented a life transformed, a future reclaimed from despair. The stone served multiple purposes. It was a celebration of the lives that had been saved and restored. It was a historical record for future generations who might wonder about the island's impact on the wider world. Most importantly, it was a reminder to Ezra himself of why his own transformation had mattered, not for his personal salvation, but for the countless others who had benefited from the sanctuary he had helped create. As he settled beside the memorial bell with the stone tablet in his lap, Ezra reflected on the patterns he had observed over the years. The Dolphins still came, still guided worthy souls to safety, but their selection process remained mysterious. They brought the broken, the lost, the ones who had nowhere else to turn, but they also brought those who had the potential to become healers rather than just patients, leaders rather than just followers. The evening light painted the Caribbean in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Ezra of the sunsets he had watched during his years of piracy. But where those earlier sunsets had marked the end of days filled with violence and greed, these marked the completion of days spent in service to something greater than himself. Young voices called from the settlement below, children born on the island, who knew no other home. They spoke a mixture of languages, their games blending traditions from across the world, their laughter carrying on the warm evening breeze. These children would grow up believing that redemption was normal, that people could change, that the mistakes of the past need not define the possibilities of the future. The scarred dolphin that had been Ezra's first confessor still appeared occasionally, now ancient by dolphin standards, but still carrying the wisdom that had guided so many transformations. When their eyes met across the water, Ezra felt the same sense of covenant that had sustained him through his darkest moments of doubt and his brightest realizations of purpose. As the sun touched the horizon, Ezra rang the memorial bell 15 times, once for each year of sanctuary, once for each year of his new life. The sound carried across the water and through the settlement, calling the community to their evening meal and their nightly sharing of stories. But tonight, as Ezra carefully placed the memorial stone beside the bell, where future guardians would find it, he felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with legacy. The island would continue long after he was gone, guided by principles he had helped establish and protected by dolphins, whose wisdom transcended human understanding. The former pirate, who had terrorized the Caribbean, had become something he could never have imagined, a man whose life served as proof that no one was beyond redemption and that some transformations could ripple outward to change the world.